Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Krishna Sen, Emeritus Professor, University of Western Australia, Social Sciences.
Krishna. Lovely to see you. Now, am I witnessing above you a fan that's whirring?
You are indeed. You are indeed. And the other thing you're looking at, I think, is an old Balinese calendar.
That was my next question. Okay, I had no idea what it was. Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's what it is. That was a wedding present from my supervisor.
Lovely. And when you say an old Balinese calendar, what happened, as it were, to that calendrical form?
Gosh, Toby, you've got me there. I mean, my writing is about contemporary Indonesian and very much, what should I say, Jakarta-centric cultural studies and modern media. You've got me at a disadvantage here. I know nothing about traditional Balinese art. However, I should, because apparently it's actually very, very much modeled on the traditional Indian one, which I also don't know much about. Though I do have, I mean, like every other child born in my time, my mother had my birth chart and stuff like that. But sorry,
Yeah.
know very little about it.
No, interesting. And I mean, that is one of the things about art in all sorts of ways, that it can be very deposited in the past, but without that being necessarily known by the people who own it, admire it, enjoy it, use it, right? And that's one of the great qualities. Is also one of the sadnesses sometimes.
So I'm not sure you would call that particular type of calendar art in the conventional Western sense, because of course it's copied and reproduced over and over and over traditionally, um, and it's not signed. It's not a signed piece of art.
Yeah.
So while we are chit-chatting, this is not exactly, I'm sure, not what you wanted to talk about, but yeah, it's not. So even Balinese paintings that you might see in collections even 100 years ago might be unsigned.
Yeah.
I'm out of my depth here, but it's not art in the modern, or at least in the modernist sense of unique signed piece of art.
Yeah. Not authorial. Well,
Not authorial.
what I did want to ask you about is my cliche question, Prof. Krishna,
Right.
which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you.
Oh, wow. That's a whole lot of things. So I think for a very long time now, perhaps going back a decade or more, I have not felt dynamized, as it were, by specific ideas. Um, and that, in many ways, to my mind, is the source of characteristic academic research work. You hang on to an idea, you drive it in a particular space. It raises questions and it directs you to answers. So, for example, my entry into the area studies model was very much charged by um, the idea that in Indonesia, the largest left-wing movement outside of the communist countries had been destroyed. So what happened? I knew nothing about Indonesia until I started thinking about Vietnam as a postgraduate student. So it's that kind of being driven by ideas, I think, seized for me at a certain point, and in part because suddenly a kind of, there seemed to be urgency in areas which had not become my specialist areas. So as you get older, of course, as you get more senior in the system, you're more and more, you're very different in this sense, but many of us, particularly those of us who go into area studies, are locked into a particular area. And in my case, that was Indonesia. And a lot of my early work was driven by the Suharto dictatorship and what do you do to destabilize the discourse and so forth. So in some ways, I think for many of us, many Indonesianists of my generation, the fall of Suharto and the changes that come through, confuses us, and we engage in some ways in that change. And that drives the research for another 10 or 15 years. And then, there is a kind of disengagement with that space. And at the same time, what happens in my case is an increasing sense that perhaps the academe itself does not provide the context in which I can do the urgent work that I need to do. So in some ways, I get more and more distracted into what else can I do? What can I do that answers to the urgent need? And for me personally, I end up in a space called PEN International very soon after I decide to take a kind of early retirement from conventional academic life. And that's now going back, 5 or 6 years. So I guess that's where I have landed. But should I go on, or have I already given you too long an answer?
No, that's great. Please continue.
Okay. So that said, something kind of interesting has happened in the last few years. Toby, this is going to be a long story and it'll take you back into the 1980s. Am I allowed to do that? I am.
The 1980s. I
Yes.
remember there was this thing called the Cold War, which I sort of.
There was a thing. It was sort of coming to an end. There was a thing called the Cold War. Okay, so 1980s. In 1981, I got fascinated with a man called Bakhtiar Siagian. He was one of the most prolific filmmakers of Indonesia in the 1950s, but he had been wiped out of official history in the pogrom of 1965. All his films had been destroyed. A few of his writings were in a restricted section of the archives. Anyway, and every little bit of reference I could see to him made me think, I need to find this person, I need to find this person. And that was a time when I arrived in Indonesia to do my PhD fieldwork in late 1979, December 1979. Many of the prominent intellectual prisoners, political prisoners, were coming out of prison. So Bakhtiar Siagian, I found out through a very famous Indonesian, probably the only Indonesian name apart from Suharto that many people know, Pramudia Anantatur. Pramudia had come out of prison, and there were a bunch of people, younger people in my generation, who were kind of gathering around him and his publishers. And Max Lane was in town about to resign from Australian public service, etc., etc. So there was a kind of excitement around, and somewhere in that melee, I found out how to track down Bakhtiar Siagian, who was not part of that kind of cultural excitement about the left. And I found him in a very tiny, what should I say? Shack is exaggerating it, but I talked to him always sitting just outside the house because there was no real space inside. There are many exciting things about Bakhtiar. One, he was incredibly handsome, even as a 60-something-year-old man, enough to create extra heartbeats in a 25-year-old. His wife, his last wife, who knows how many wives he had, but his wife at that time was in fact younger than me. So there were all kinds of things that were personally intriguing about Bakhtiar. Anyway, the intellectual part of it was he really gave me a way of seeing Indonesian films in a completely different way. I wrote about it, and that was part of my thesis. And as largely as a result of that, and not just my critique of Suharto's propaganda and censorship and stuff like that, but partly because of that, my thesis itself got put in the restricted section of the Indonesian Film Archives. So access to Indonesian friends could only get access from me. So anyway, nothing much more happened. Eventually, along with various other people, Bakhtiar was slightly brought back into view. The government gave him a kind of cultural award at a time when there was a very, very liberal director general of culture in Indonesia about 10 years ago. Anyway, I got an email from somebody with the name Siagian a few years ago. This was his daughter, who hadn't been born when I was interviewing him. She was born much later. But she was in the process of basically tracking down every bit of material that could be found. And to now cut a long story short, Bunga Siagian, who's the daughter, eventually found a copy of his fourth film, I think, Turang, a film called Turang, in a small archive in Tashkent. And she brought it back, and we had the first screening of that in Indonesia a month ago, and I was able to be there. So it was like this kind of astounding thing, which has suddenly made me think maybe the work that academics do, even at my scale, which I don't think is scaled up to a kind of big global impact stuff, even at that scale, it is kind of important. It works in a certain way. I'm beginning to think about more carefully about what did I get out of the screening, which I hadn't got from all the reviews and conversations. What was in the visual language, which of course you cannot know until you see the film. So yeah, it's been a kind of exciting reconnection. Sorry, Toby, I've forgotten what you asked me.
It was a very general question about what's mattering to you now.
Well, there you go.
What you've done is connect young woman in the late 1970s through to a still young woman in the mid 2020s.
Well, I have actually connected to a young woman, but the young woman is not called Krishna. Her name is Bunga Siagian. She's the daughter of this filmmaker. So I have indeed connected.
Yeah. So I think that's a wonderful story. And it's also interesting because, pardon my coughing, I sense that there's a certain ambivalence, maybe even rejection of academic life in what you were saying, a decision to move away from it, but perhaps a satisfaction in the sense that it can have a social impact decades later in ways that had never been imagined. Have I got that right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so when I was doing the research, we never expected to see the Suharto government go, or that a kind of democracy would be reestablished. And it's also the timing at which this particular film is re-emerging, because this is exactly the time when the new Indonesian government, the new president Prabowo, who is actually probably a war criminal and was one of Suharto's senior generals towards the end of. So the coincidence that this film should arrive in Indonesia at this moment, when the relevant minister is talking about rewriting a positive national history a bit like that kind of discourse that comes up in Australia from time to time. Not the black band, what is it? Not the black band view of history and so forth. So that kind of discourse is re-emerging in Indonesia, that we must always tell a positive national story and so forth. And the idea of truth telling and apologizing is disappearing from Indonesian discourse again. So the timing of the arrival of that film into Indonesia has been incredible. And Bunga herself talks about how the film probably wanted to be found at this time. It sounds silly, but
I'm thinking back to around the time of Suharto's fall, the collapse of the regime, when Clifford Geertz was still the person the New York Times went to
yeah,
for a read on all of this. And of course, getting back to the area studies domain of which you spoke earlier, Geertz could not imagine any kind of political economic explanation for anything, least of all the change of regimes.
yeah, yeah.
So he poo-pooed all of this.
Mm.
And if he's one wing of the white male establishment of US area studies on Indonesia, the other one is Ben Anderson,
Indeed.
who had somewhat less access over the preceding decades than Clifford
Yeah.
Geertz, but got it right pretty much by contrast.
Mm.
Would that be a fair thing to say?
So, look, even when Ben Anderson couldn't visit Indonesia, and he couldn't for a long time, he had the most incredible links into current Indonesian political leadership. He was connected to all of those students who were kind of beginning to take an interest in the recovery of the left-wing history of Indonesia. So Ben had access to Indonesia in remarkable ways. And the other thing about Anderson is that he had always been, I don't know if you read his specialist Indonesia stuff, which is very different from the Imagined Community book, which everybody has read, of course. But he in fact had a very peculiar take on Indonesian history. And that was centered around the idea that there was this kind of age element, a generational element in Indonesian history, and his complete faith in this thing that in his book Java in a Tribe of Revolution shows up as youth. And that's become part of the Indonesian political discourse. So Ben often could see the kind of impending stuff. But to be fair to Geertz, and this is, our one-time colleague, Alec McCall, used to say there is a very simple way of distinguish between modes of thought. Why some of us are lumpers and some of us are splitters. So in some ways, I guess, if you thought about Geertz in that mode of somebody who's thinking of long-term cultural processes, you could then begin to think about the ways in which the pre-IE, this is one of Geertz's categories that he uses in his work, is the Javanese pre-IE and the dominance and the conflict between the Islamic and the pre-IE traditions. And you could think of those pre-IE traditions coming back into action with someone like Prabowo in alliance with Islam if he needs to have that alliance. So it is, that kind of very long sweep of history is perhaps not something that either you or I, as people doing contemporary cultural studies, would find very interesting. I mean, I don't find those kinds of long historic sweeps of cultural explanation as though there is some stable thing called Java, very useful. So for me, the Anderson notion about conflicts of some other trajectories where the conflict is more important rather than the stability in broad terms is more important.
I'm quite taken, and thank you for that. Can I ask you about something else you mentioned, Krishna, which was, I think you used the expression pan-international.
No, sorry. Not pan-international. Pen, as in the writing.
Oh, Penn
Pen.
International. Oh my God. I'm
That's
sorry.
my,
And actually,
I am so sorry. That's my Australian accent.
you had actually written to me about Penn International, and I'd forgotten. Well, it's an interesting mistake to have made on my part.
It is pan-international, of course, although pan-international is
It's
probably not a
that
word.
too. So let's go with what you were really saying as opposed to my maniacal interpretation. Tell us about your commitments to Penn International.
So, okay, so this is something that I've been very engaged with over the last few years. And part of it, I think, comes not from my kind of Indonesia engagement, but a kind of taking myself back to my Indian context.
Mm-hmm.
And a realization that under Modi, we are probably, India is probably in a space that it has never been in, except for the couple of years um, under Indira Gandhi's emergency rule in the
Mm-hmm.
early 70s. So again, people who are very young won't be able to identify with this, but some of us became politicized in that time in the early 70s as teenagers, right? And so for me, the discovery that India suddenly again had political prisoners and that Penn International now counts more writers in prison in India than in Southeast Asia was a kind of shocking realization. And I sort of began to think, what would I do once I stopped being Dean of Arts? What could I do that would be would use some of the skills and connections and institution building learned in that time that would be useful, immediate, you know, perhaps just shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, but not just sitting there thinking about shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. So those were my options about what to do that felt like something immediate, practical. And just at that point, a linguist friend of mine in India brought to my attention, and by this time I was already kind of becoming engaged in the little Perth center of Penn that colleagues from UWA had been involved in creating. People like, you may not know, Dennis Haskell, who's a poet, West Australian poet, and was professor of English. So Dennis had, as it were, rebirthed a Penn International Centre in Perth, which I joined. And Penn, if you're in many of your listeners won't know, Penn International is actually probably the oldest surviving global non-profit that is there. It was established in 1919 on the same sorts of principles of international global peace movements that there were many of at the end of the First World War, but this is one that has survived. And if you think about organizations that are much better known, like Amnesty International, in many ways, they are modeled on pen. And pen, whose purpose was at the beginning simply to have a way of conversing across political differences between creative writers, morphed after the Second World War into something which was particularly focused on not losing connection with the East European writers, with the writers on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and so forth. And it became more and more, in the Cold War in particular, and with the rise of China, became more and more about supporting writers at risk, writers in prison, whether these difficulties for writers was from the governments or from political thugs or whatever. So it was a kind of, so I found myself in this group globally, of people who are engaged in a relatively narrow piece of work, so that you can think about things carefully and do. It's not standing on the street kind of activism. It's an activism about information, about persuasion, about lobbying. So that's the kind of activism that PEN does. And it does so only on behalf of people who it defines as writers, journalists, bloggers. The definition of writers is now getting increasingly difficult, but also has been engaged with something that is fundamental to cultural studies, this space that we want to keep open as for responsible freedom of speech, I guess. So that's the PEN International spiel, Toby.
Wonderful. Thank you. And it's had its own controversies over the last little while at different points, something that's entirely inevitable and not necessarily symptomatic of some sort of failing. And if you've been alive for 100 years, you're going to get into trouble every now and then. Let's face it.
So it was not nearly as much trouble as it got into on the eve of the Second World War, because you can imagine that the Jewish writers would wanted PEN to be vastly more politically engaged. And for a long time, even as a young woman myself, when I first heard about this organization, it was often defined as relatively right wing, because it occupies that kind of, what should I say, it makes this great effort to occupy a space that it likes to think of as the middle and not being pulled left or right. And you can imagine how difficult a middle space is at a time. I mean, I suspect you're referring to the difficulties that PEN America in particular got into in the context of the Netanyahu government's genocide in Palestine, and it was overuse of words like genocide. Yeah, so look, that's a PEN America business. The PEN centers are very, very autonomous. There were some resignations from the PEN central office in London as well, but it has survived as a group. We have survived, and the Australian groups. There's three of us. That's another funny story, but there are three groups in Australia, and I think we are only allowed three per nation, or some weird thing like that. And most bodies are national bodies, but Australia has these three little centres in three little cities, no, three big cities, and the Australian scene has stayed completely unanimous and have really not been engaged in that as a conflict.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
By being careful about how we use our words in the official contexts.
Getting back to South Asia, if we could, for a moment, and Modi and these terms like RSS and Hindutva. He's a totally frightening man for people like me. at a distance. He is,
Imagine how frightening he is for women like me.
and there is a profoundly patriarchal element there, it seems to me, as an ignorant outsider. Could you talk a little bit about that element of Hindutva, of the RSS, etc.?
Yeah, I think the person who talks most eloquently about this issue is probably Arundhati Roy.
Sure.
And in many of her writings, including her most recent book. So the thing that strikes me most is the way in which the Modi system is starting to trying to redefine what traditional Hinduism is. One of the interesting things for feminists who know the Hindu mythology is that for every male god, there is a more powerful female god. And so as you write the gods further and further back into history, you get to the mother goddess, and she is far and away the most powerful, and she has the most formats in which godheads are worshipped and so forth. And one of the bizarre controversies that the Modi government generated was by trying to insist on Rama, who is their mascot basically, as the great god, as the single great god. One, Rama is of no consequence to the peripheral bits of India. So, for example, Rama barely emerges in West Bengal, where I come from. Our big festivals are all around mother goddesses, either in her violent form, which is Kali, or in her benevolent form, which is Durga. Too complicated to explain. But anyway, there's been, in the last few years, right on the modern political stage, a conflict over mythologies, and the attempt of the Modi government to somehow define the religion into a patriarchal straitjacket, which is incredibly difficult to do. It's incredibly difficult to do because of the dominance of the mother goddesses. And the fact that they pick Rama is, rather than perhaps the more, what should I say, philandering Lord Krishna or somebody like that, or the crazy in love Lord Shiva, they pick someone like Rama is particular because if you look at the story of the Ramayana, it's a story of colonialism. It's basically the white Aryans coming down, sweeping across the Indian mainland, and trying to establish a dominant culture, which they never managed, which the Aryans never managed to do. They intermarry, and historically it all gets confused, and the mother goddess keeps coming back and becoming prominent. I had a lovely opportunity to write about this somewhat academically for a special issue of the Australian, was it the Art Gallery magazine, the National Art Gallery in Canberra, or was it the National Museum, one of those, a year or two ago, where they had brought from the British Museum an exhibition of violent, uncontrollable women. And of course, Kali played a big role in that. And so I was able to write about this. But yeah, so there is an attempt not just to use Hinduism and its patriarchal formats in the Modi domination story, but also to redefine the religion itself as though it is a single patriarchal religion, which we can only see in terms of that Aryan invasion into native indigenous cultures of India in prehistoric times. So yeah, there are loads of layers of these battles to be fought, including an area where, most contemporary feminists wouldn't want to engage, because who the hell wants to talk about religion? But that's becoming a significant issue.
And this brings me to something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, which is how sad I am that Weber's notion of the disenchantment of the world doesn't apply. But, and
It
then,
doesn't.
if anything, a re-enchantment of the world, or there was never a disenchantment. And of course, ironically, Weber thought he knew a lot about India and China, amongst other places that he didn't know very much about. But he was a genius, I think, nevertheless, in lots of ways. Could you speak a little bit about the importance of spirituality / religion in your experiences, in particular, of India and Indonesia?
Look, in a sense, I grew up rejecting everything religious, right? And so, in a sense, I'm an outsider to that spiritual domain. I was born into a household where the rituals did happen, but the rituals happened in the kind of grandmother, mother, elderly aunt section, and not the fathers and grandfathers. And you'll know that many women in my generation who have become feminists were in fact very much father identified, and we are coming back to rethinking our mothers. And Arundhati Roy's book is an interesting,
Oh, it's astonishing about her mother, isn't it?
yeah, is an interesting recovery of her mother. But she had the
Yeah.
advantage that she couldn't be father identified, right?
Well, it's a
She didn't
sort of
have a,
recovery, but it's
yeah.
as ambivalent as they get,
Yeah,
as
it says ambivalent.
recoveries can
Well,
be.
it is ambivalent. I mean, relationships with mothers must be ambivalent, but you're not a mother, so I won't talk to you about that. Um, so, uh, so there is a sense in which there is a religiosity that is important in a way that perhaps is not important in the West. Perhaps we can make that kind of a distinction between the South in Southeast Asian context and the so-called the Western context. But I don't think it is spirituality in the sense in which you would define a modern idea of spirituality, which you might do via someone like Gandhi. But perhaps, and look, I haven't thought about this for a very, very long time, but perhaps the notion of enchantment is a more significant one, because the notion of enchantment is not the same as spirituality. It's yeah. Look, I haven't thought it through, but you've asked me an interesting question, and I should try to think about this. I should definitely try to think. But it is more the domain of magic than the domain of spirituality. If you think of spirituality as the engagement with the transcendental. Anyway.
Moving on to a more media-oriented plane, when you started doing your field work in Indonesia, it was a period that many of us thought was the high point of the so-called New Order. And you were interested in media systems then, and you kept being interested in them after that, all the way through to the idea of international media reform movements. And you've written and edited on that topic in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere as well. I wonder if you could give us a sense of that period of 15, 20 years in your work and what you saw in terms of the media under or in or as the new order of Suharto versus what came thereafter?
So when I started, if I do go back as far back as the 80s, so the early work, my PhD, the first book, all of that is written very much under the framework of the national media, which of course very quickly after that. I mean, my work became so outdated so quickly, it's embarrassing. But the whole idea of the national, some sort of a zone of national boundary for the media began to collapse, right? And it began to collapse by the 90s. Once you had satellite television and then social media. So I then obviously became interested. I wanted to drop the idea of an Indonesian media, and we then formulated in my work with David and with a couple of other people, we then began to think about this as the media as it operates inside. So there is something called the nation, and that's called Indonesia, and there is a media that is inside that those boundaries. So how do we understand that interaction between something which is global, but something which is also was consumption and production and economy are also constantly being constrained by the national boundary. So it was that kind of area that I became interested in. With the move to what I think of my life still as an emeritus professor, but under a sort of, what should I say, under a bit of a pretense, because really I'm not doing academic work. When I think about my work as an activist for PEN International, what you're trying to do in some ways is to use the media to get across the national boundaries, because the restrictions, there is a sense in which the algorithms and so forth make the restrictions and the limitations within which we operate not a nationally bounded process. But we are also trying to breach the national processes, the national media bounding processes, if you like, through international connections, through international activism. So I think this kind of, if I were to write an academic piece of work, I would now find it difficult to find terminology within which to talk about where the media sits within that framework that we might call international, because of course international definitely means that nations exist, but where the media operates within all that. But Toby, you know much more about this than I do.
One of the things that struck me about the discourse about, in inverted commas, Asia, is that at a geopolitical level, it's very much become about India and China.
Yes.
Partly because they're the two most populous nations in the world by far, partly because of their extraordinary political, economic, and cultural power more in the case of India. And that this means that vast countries like Indonesia and quite small ones get a bit left out of that world, of that discussion. Even Japan can be left out of that discussion for all its astonishing economic importance and geopolitical significance as well. And I wondered if you would reflect on that for a bit about what Asia, it's a very big question, I realize, but what Asia means today, and what's the space if you're not one of the two big beasts, as it were?
So that's very interesting, because, but let me start with this notion of some countries get left out. Indonesia scholars are constantly whinging about Indonesia being left out, and you constantly, And you constantly hear how Australia, which is going to be, so far behind Indonesia in population, economic power, and so forth, we ought to be paying more attention to Indonesia because it's going to be the 11th largest economy in about 5 years, whatever. And they don't figure. They don't figure. But so Indonesia doesn't figure in global considerations in some ways. On the other hand, part of what we as academics see as the ignoring of Indonesia in particular, perhaps of Singapore, perhaps of Malaysia as well, but I know the Indonesia part better. It's partly, I think, that this is going to sound terrible, Toby, but I think it's partly to do with important books being written about and from the perspective of those countries. So you think about the number of disciplines like history, like economics, which you couldn't study without looking at the important texts generated by both about India but also by scholars in India, and ditto China. And you look at the numbers of Chinese and Indians in the academies of the West. There's a kind of accident, I think, that happens. But all of a sudden, you have an important book about, what is it called? The life cycle of one of the spices, written by, I'm having a senior moment. Do you want to stop so I can look at my books that I've just read, so I know which book I'm talking about?
For
Or
sure.
you want me to
No, we can
stop?
do that. Let's pause. Prof. Sen has reached back, as they say in baseball commentary, into her,
I haven't reached back and back. This is
her
actually a
reading.
pretty new book. What I was about to say is that sometimes it's just the presence of an important book that pushes a nation into being considered. And the two books that I was thinking of, and I've only read them in the last couple of years, shows you how bad my brain is these days. But one of them is a book called Revolutie by David Van Raybroek. And that looks at the way in which the Indonesian independence movement was absolutely central to the history of national liberation, the early stage of decolonization in the late 40s, early 50s. And the other book I was thinking of was The Nutmeg's Curse by Amitav Ghosh, which is the life cycle of, it's a spice trade thing and the centrality of that region. So I just wonder, as these books make their historic impact, is Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular going to figure more importantly in the same way that the story of India has been brought very much into, but maybe I'm what should I say, overstating the power of books, but I don't know. I mean, we read, and what else can we talk about?
Well, you read them, you write them, you edit them, and you defend them. So it's not
Something
unreasonable
like
you
that.
should be somewhat book-centric, if that's a term. One of the things that strikes me here, thinking back Ben Anderson and his memoir, which I think is a terrific book, is that area studies, if we can still use that term, and I'm a very small part of it, but I've been in it for quite a while, is very scarred by the sorts of tensions that he points out within Cornell's what was it called? East Asian Studies or Southeast Asian
Yeah,
Studies
Southeast
program?
Asian studies.
Southeast Asian Studies, where he was in political science, I guess, right?
Yes.
And how these were just CIA crooks on the one hand, right? Quite a lot of them. And and then nice, decent liberals, and then slightly unaware, blinkered Marxists who just wanted to get on a bicycle in Indonesia and roam around and meet families and have fun, which was him. This is his version of it, anyway, as I recall, the memoir. And I wanted to ask you about that rather compromised bit of it. And I should say that my half brother did his PhD on an Indian village and in the 1960s. And when in those days, as a person from what we now call the global north, you arrived in India, a CIA operative would tell you which village you would go and visit and write your doctorate on, and who would be your interlocutors.
Toby, I should know your brother because he was an anthropologist in Melbourne, was he not? Monash.
Indeed, he was.
Yes. So remind me of his name.
So
How
his
could I
name
forget?
is Don Miller,
John
and
Miller.
and
Yes.
he was Swift's golden boy, both when he
Yes.
was undergrad, because he and our father were Australian, and he went on, amongst other things, with his late wife to co-found the first university for the deaf in Thailand. And
Wow.
and really in addition to having written a book with her, Jan Branson, about
Yes.
gender and education in Australia. So Thailand, I think, became more their thing. But initially, Swift, or whoever it was, sent him off
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
India.
Yeah.
Whereas I
Yeah.
say they were told, you should don't go to one of those Maoist villages.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go to one of
Look,
our villages.
I I can kind of believe this story, but remember that time even precedes my time in some ways, that
Yes, yes,
perhaps
it would.
perhaps this is the 70s, which I don't really know because I'm still
It was the
relatively,
60s. It was the
yeah, so I'm
Vietnam
still,
War.
yeah, so I can imagine, and of course, India would have been an incredibly interesting space for the. So I'm assuming you're talking about Don's experience of this, the CIA encounter, rather than Ben's, rather than
Oh,
Ben
yes. No,
Anderson's.
I mean, Ben's was about the CIA being embedded in his
Yes,
heart
yeah.
in Ithaca. And
So yes,
Don's was
but
about arriving in India and suddenly being,
yes,
I mean, he didn't actually accept the invitation, but others did, right?
yeah, yeah. But 60s in India, I can imagine would have been I have no active memory of quite that. Yeah, I mean, I was still 10, 11, 12 years old. Anyway, so relatively young then. So I wouldn't know this. Certainly not really know it. So let me answer this in two ways. One, India in the 60s would have been a very difficult space for the CIA in some ways, because remember, Coca-Cola is banned in India at that time, these big American companies, huge, huge restrictions on US movies. And some people have said to me that one of the first signs of the anxiety of Americans about Indonesia comes in over the restrictions that the Indonesian government started to put on American films coming into Indonesia. And one of the and this is all happening in the late 50s, early 60s. Somebody just a month ago, when I was in Indonesia, kind of relating after many years to that kind of film community, in the process of launching Bakhtiar's Bakhtiar Siagian's film. One of the film scholars, current film scholars, mentioned to me that this kind of anxiety over restrictions on American films is just rising again in Indonesia. So there was almost this sense that, oh my God, we are revisiting the early 60s, not because there are any legal restrictions, but because over the last 10 years, popularity of Indonesian films, locally produced films, has risen and risen and risen, and they can outcompete American films in most markets. Indonesian cinema is now occupying 60% of the market, which, so anyway, so the films, I've gone back into films instead of thinking about the CIA, but the CIA stuff, it was very common in both Indonesia and India, I think, to quickly mark things off as that's a CIA front. I'm not sure this was, I mean, it could be correct, but so for example, I'm not sure if David Hill, my partner and my kind of academic partner in some books, this is not for you so much, Toby, but for your listeners, if there are any. So David, for example, I don't know if you'd want me to tell the story, but I'm going to anyway. David got into terrible trouble with Ben Anderson because David wrote the biography of a guy called Mokhtar Lubis. And Ben absolutely detested Mokhtar, and we were at a party and Ben got into this horrible conflict with David over arguing that Mokhtar was CIA agent. And David turned around and said, prove it. I've got every piece of his paper and his library. Prove it. Because, you can't prove it. How do you prove it? How do you prove individuals were? I'm not underplaying the role of the CIA. I mean, the role of the CIA in Indonesia is absolutely documented, and that it was a model. But did your brother really talk to CIA agents in India? I don't know. He did.
I'll tell
Oh
you
my God.
I'll tell you when we're not recording.
Okay. Yes, you might want to go back to America, and they now want you to make sure that, you're not anti-American.
Oh, one of the things about this period too, which we're revisiting now, as Pakistan's government is sucking up to Trump, is that during the height of the Cold War, Pakistan was the US's choice, and India was very much on the outer. And when the Cold War ended, the US, in its imperial fashion, just dumped Pakistan. It didn't matter anymore. It wasn't an important front. And this led to all kinds of problems, many of which we still experience today. But one of the things that the current Pakistani administration wants to do is to get on well with the United States. And there are still people that it knows from the good old days of the Cold War that it connects to. And it used to be the case, I don't know if it still is, that every year the Pentagon hosts a meeting of the top military brass from India and Pakistan, and they sit down in DC. I know some people have been at these meetings, and they say, how are we going to avoid a war? Right?
Yeah.
And this fantasy of below decks manipulation by the United States when it comes to the two big beasts of South Asia has continued with all kinds of complicated twists and turns as the United States has lost interest, gained interest, worried about, not cared about, and so on. But I guess my point about the CIA was simply to say that, and this doesn't just apply to Asia, area studies was the creature of the Ford Foundation.
Yeah.
Creature,
very much so,
in many ways, of its connections to the federal government, and the idea that how do we get emerging countries not to be Maoist, Marxist-Leninist? That was there. And they gave lots of money to people who look like me in anthropology, sociology, political science, and languages. That doesn't mean that that characterizes those countries and their academic worlds. And of course, it's not come to mean what area studies is, because area studies has become one of the most vibrant and exciting areas of the social sciences and the humanities.
Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting that you say so, because in some ways that goes against what, say, many people like Dipesh Chakraborty would talk about in terms of the planetary turn in history, and the the two books that I mentioned to you earlier, one Revolusi, which is about Indonesia, but always focusing on its global consequences. The Nutmeg's Curse, which is a kind of history of that particular spice through that region, but all of that with that kind of, what in Dipesh Chakraborty's terms we would think of as the planetary perspective. Perhaps not Revolusi so much, but certainly not Nutmeg's Curse. So it's interesting that you are thinking, I'm sorry to turn this kind of interview back to you in some ways. Interesting to me that you're thinking of area studies as a kind of rich, productive area at the moment, because I mean, look, I haven't done serious thinking about this, as I've confessed, for 10 years, but one of the things that I've been thinking is whether in fact uh, area studies is becoming more and more a kind of no longer a study of particular nations, but a study of movements across the region. It's like, in many ways, continuing that trend from the 90s, probably at least, of writing back to, the empire writes back, you write back to Europe, the colonization of Europe in, again, Dipesh Chakraborty's book. So, what was the name of the book where he talks about the way Europe loses power in some provincializing Europe, I think is the book. So in a sense, it's not area studies as I grew up with, but so you could be right that there's a certain redefinition of area studies going on. I don't know, is that how you're seeing it, or you're seeing it as a return of area studies as very specific, very detailed studies of particular things in particular spaces within particular nations?
For me, it can be both. But the big thing that much of area studies offers is just decentering the imperial condition without
Yeah,
getting it,
yeah,
and being prepared to prioritize alternative modes of thinking
yeah,
and experiences in ways that are linguistically and historically specific and counter the grander traditions, in inverted commas, even as they can be very planetary.
yeah, yeah. So in that sense, you're absolutely correct. One of the things that frustrates me, for example, um, even in terms of the work, PEN America does an enormous amount of good work in terms of translations, but it's almost always translations from or into English. We seem to have worked out no way, for example, of translating from one Asian language directly into another, because there's so few of us who are fluent in two Asian languages. And I mean, my examples are obviously all from Indonesian and Bengali. Bengali is my mother tongue, and Indonesian, which I speak probably and read read well enough to enjoy poetry, and that's kind of a reasonable amount of, But I often find there are words and expressions and ideas which I can translate perfectly from Indonesian to Bengali or Bengali to Indonesian. But when it comes via English, because there is no way to translate that into English properly, that in fact so all of Tagore in Indonesian is translated out of English. Now, Tagore in English is revolting. Tagore in English is unreadable. It is so bad because his rhythms and the affect just does not translate. Whereas it could into Indonesian, and yet it has never happened and probably will never happen. So it's, I don't know. How many languages do you speak, Toby Miller?
3.
Spanish being one.
Right.
What's the other one?
French. So
Spanish to French, there are probably lots of direct translations, whereas Asian languages, not so much.
No, Spanish has thousands of Arabic words in it.
Yeah.
Maybe 3,000. Because of the North African invasion and colonization of Spain. And it has hundreds, if not thousands, of indigenous words from Latin America. So in that sense, it is very interesting because it's the product of colonialism as well as being the master of colonialism. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it does have these fascinating connections. And I read Portuguese and Catalan and Valenciano.
You read Catalan?
Yeah. I can't speak it, but I can read it. And Valenciano, which is really the same as Catalan.
Oh, okay.
Although, don't say that or, I'll get shocked.
No.
You didn't hear it from me. These are obviously minority languages. We're talking about a few million people.
Yeah.
The one that always fascinates me is Basque because it's the only remaining Paleo-European language. It's not Indo-European. It's completely other. It's like Etruscan or something, right? And they've somehow or other kept it going. But anyway, I guess my point is I'm really appreciating what you're saying about when we're talking about much bigger, more significant language groups in Asia. The lack of norms, funds, tendencies, trends to translate between cultures and languages that might have a lot more in common if they didn't go via the English conduit. This reminds me of all those days when to make a phone call from Bangladesh to India, you might actually be routed through London, right? And this is long after freedom from the imperial yoke, right? Went on forever. So no, those things are incredibly important and fascinating. And I guess we live in an era of some level of computer translation, which can be pretty good, but it's not interpretation. When I use it and I compare it to the things I can read, write, and speak at very basic levels, I learned these things in the streets and looking at monuments and newspapers. I didn't learn them academically. I realized that at the level of a very basic translation between, say, Spanish and Portuguese, this works quite well, and they've got lots of things in common. But when it comes to interpreting profound meaning per Tagore, it doesn't work at all. It's completely
No, it doesn't work at all. Yeah.
Right?
No, it doesn't work. And also machine translation, I suspect, works a lot better in the case of languages where there is a huge body of translation from each other. So between French and Spanish, it'll work very well. Between Indonesian and Bengali, it doesn't work at all. I've had a go.
Have you?
And yeah, it makes terrible errors. Fundamental, but just you have to think about why on earth did you make this error, and you have to think through why it did so, because there's some bit of the root word. Both Indonesian and Bengali have kind of the root word and then bits and pieces going off on all prefixes, suffixes. So it holds on, it makes terrible errors because after all, it is drawing on the body of translations that exist. And then there isn't a body of translation directly between those languages enough to give it that level of sophistication that you will find between European languages. Toby, we've gone a lot more than at the time you said.
I'm sorry, Krishna, we have. Let me suggest we bring things to a close with my asking you if there's something that you'd like to add, and that might relate to terrain we've already covered, or it might be something that we haven't touched on at all. How would you like to bring things to a close?
So I guess I will go back to what we could have talked more about, but we didn't. The kind of work that I think is valuable versus what I think of as academic work. And this is not meant to be a critique of academic work in general at all. It always feels like, academic work is much removed from an immediate crisis. Whereas the work that I do as an activist, because that's what I do in Penn, is the work that has to do with somebody's immediate pain or distress, which is both individual and reflects on the larger picture. So I want to finish with, I guess, you've given me a chance to talk about a guy called Hani Babu. Hani is a Muslim. Hani is married to a Christian woman. They are both academics. Hani was a teaching at Delhi University, which is probably India's most prominent university. It's a seriously good university in some ways. Amartya Sen taught there for a while, so it's got to be a good university, right? So Hani was arrested about 5 years ago under the excuse that, well, with the charge that he had provoked violence in which a person had died. So provocation of violence, provocation to riot was the kind of general rubric under which 16 people were arrested, included Hani, included an 80-year-old poet, or 75-year-old poet, but people like that, people you would never think had instigated riots. Turned out Hani wasn't there. He wasn't at the conference at which he was supposed to have spoken, and he hadn't been invited to it. So it's not only that he hadn't gone, but he hadn't been invited. It's taken the world community, world community, and a huge amount of support inside in India to get him out of prison into effectively city arrest now in Bombay under very strict bail conditions. 5 years and 3 months, a time during which he was held without a charge, along with several people. Most other people slowly got released and bailed. He was amongst the last. There are still 3, I think, still to go. But it's a story of which kind of does 2 things for me, and this interpretation may be quite wrong. One is that somehow the political system in India is maybe totally corrupted, but perhaps we have some hope left in society and in the judicial system, and that even low-level global activism ultimately has some kind of impact. And that makes me think, well, this kind of work is worth doing, and often is the kind of work we can do as academics. And we can do these things as academics because the title of professor gives you a bit of authority. And we are all globally networked. So that would be my good news story for the end of the year. And thank you for giving me a chance to say it.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Krishna. I have learnt from your work over many decades, and I've learnt a lot from you today. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Toby.